A part of the American story is the evolution of America's armed forces and the overlooked narrative of the black service member. Often, in the face of racial discrimination, many African Americans volunteered to serve under the most challenging circumstances, only to prevail heroically. One such American was Dan Bullock. Born in Goldsboro, North Carolina, he dreamed at an early age of becoming a pilot, a police officer, a Marine. On May 8, 1969, Private First Class Dan Bullock arrived in Vietnam. 1 month later, he was dead. As the youngest American killed during the Vietnam War, PFC Bullock has never been fully recognized for his service to his country. This is his story.
We grew up together. That was my best friend.
Yeah.
And everybody loved him. You know, he was wonderful. He was smart, intelligent, and very adventurous. We had long distance trucks that we would put match stems on. The big matches for the officers and the little ones for the regular soldiers.
Right.
And we would get in the backyard and we would play war.
After Dan's grandmother died, the family moved to Brooklyn, New York, where Dan's aspirations and dreams of joining the military grew. At the age of 14, Dan Bullock would make a decision that will alter the course of his life.
He just wanted to make a difference and change, and ever since he was little, he always wanted to go into the military. It's not clear who helped him alter his birth certificate, because my grandfather said he didn't, you know, but Dan was so very mature for his age, and we was all proud of him.
I met Dan Bullock in October 1968 in boot camp. And he didn't make it in the platoon he was in, so they put him in my platoon. And I really hadn't met him yet, but I saw him for the first time then. After he failed a couple of runs, we were beginning to get punished as a result of him not keeping up. And some of the Marines, white Southern Marines, wanted to give him a blanket party. I overheard them talking about giving him a blanket party, and I interceded on his behalf. I was from Brooklyn, and I knew then he was from Brooklyn, and I felt an obligation to try to help him out. The fact that he was only 14 years old, and it was something that he probably needed to be about 18 or 19 in order to be able to do. It was the toughest thing I ever did, and anybody could ever do, is go through Marine Corps boot camp. And I don't think he was mentally ready for it yet. I didn't know a lot about Dan because we never, in boot camp, you don't get a lot of opportunities to talk. But I did realize eventually that he was determined. He loved the Marine Corps, he loved his family, and he tried very hard. He tried hard. And I could see that, that he needed help. The day of graduation from boot camp is the day that we all get to meet and celebrate our victories as far as graduating from boot camp. So I had an opportunity to speak with him then and a few other Marines, and we're all looking forward to just going home and being with our families. I didn't actually go to Vietnam, but Dan did.
Well, the situation in early 1969 in Vietnam, this was a period when we had reached peak troop strength. We maxed out at around 545,000 troops in the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And so this was the moment when the United States was bringing its maximum strength to bear. The war had gone on for over 3 years at a very high intensity by this point, and it seemed clear to everyone on both sides that the United States was not going to win a victory in the traditional sense of the word by this stage. Negotiations were underway with the North Vietnamese, and so this was a period where the United States was fighting for an outcome where the South Vietnamese government would eventually be able to go it more or less alone. So as the phrase was at the time, the United States was fighting for time. And so in Quang Nam province, where Dan Bullock was to serve with the 1st Marine Division, this was one of the critical areas in the country and had been since the United States had really gotten involved in a big way in 1965. The An Hoa Valley, which is south and west of the city of Da Nang, was a heavily populated, very fertile basin that had produced a lot of food, a lot of manpower. There was also a Marine combat base called the An Hoa Combat Base at the sort of southern edge of the valley. This is where Dan Bullock would eventually be stationed.
Dan Bullock and I landed in Vietnam together. We were assigned to the same unit. 2nd platoon of Fox Company had lost most of a platoon, so they took replacements and put them in this one platoon, 2nd platoon. There were only 11 men left after a Mother's Day mortar attack. So we were in the rear at An Hoa Fire Base, and that's we didn't go out to the bush. We were waiting for the men to come back, and in that time we got to know each other, not too well because Dan was protecting a secret, but we did talk. I befriended him because the men who were in the field, who came back to the rear, didn't like Dan for some reason. They didn't know what it was, but they were kind of angry with him. He didn't do anything. He didn't speak. He was okay. He and I would spar. He and I would go to chow together, and I felt like a big brother to him.
At this point in the war, the troops that were fighting, the American troops, Marines and soldiers and airmen and naval personnel, were a mix of drafted people and people who had volunteered. If you, let's say, entered the service and you were 18 or 19, you'd go to basic training, and you would go through the system that would turn you into basically a private or the equivalent of a private first class within a year or so. Now, a lot of those soldiers or Marines were in fact sent to Vietnam pretty much out of their advanced infantry training. So they hadn't been in the service probably more than a year or so, and they were put into a dangerous situation almost from the moment they stepped off the plane. For a lot of these young Marines like Dan Bullock, it might have been several weeks before they actually saw action. But when they did start going out on patrols and start participating in these operations, they were expected to pull their weight, from the moment they stepped outside the wire.
He would go out on these small patrols. We'd check out bunkers. We'd check the wire to make sure the enemy didn't cut it. We'd be on bunker duty at night, filling sandbags during the day. And all this until the company came back. When they came back from the Arizona Territory, they were in no mood for new men, myself included. They did not like breaking in new men because we didn't know the sights, sounds, smells, or what to do during an attack. So these are all combat veterans. And for some reason, which we found out later, it was Dan did everything he was told to do, and yet he was the last person picked for bunker duty or whatever. And the day of the attack, he and I were sparring, and he dislocated my thumb. So I couldn't use my rifle that night. So I was sent to guard tanks. He went to the bunkers, and that night the enemy broke in. They used satchel charges, sacks of explosives. They tossed onto the bunkers or into the bunkers and blew them up, and that then the other ones could infiltrate. They're trying to blow up stores of ammunition, like artillery shells, and if they could, planes or whatever. They didn't really get through. Some of them broke through. One of them actually made it into the regimental area. But Dan's bunker and everyone in it, the 4 men were in it, Bunn, Honeycutt, Eggensdorfer, and Bullock, were all killed, probably instantly, because none of them got out of the bunker. The enemy that got over the bunker, we heard later, had fired into it just to make sure they had killed everyone in it. So there possibility of gunshot wounds and explosion. So none of our men could get to that bunker because they kept the enemy away, but there was a trench line behind it, and that's where the men were fighting from. So in the morning, we had to hold positions, or they did. I was still at the tanks, and another unit of Marines came in and removed the bodies. So none of us ever saw him, or Eggensdorfer, Bunn, and Honeycutt. We didn't see the bodies.